All right, there's four more electrolytes that we want to take a look at in this chapter, beginning with calcium. Now, calcium is very important for several reasons, and you probably have looked at calcium before in 168 when you go through bone physiology and bone function. Calcium is regulated in a very narrow range. That's because of its importance, and it is regulated through several factors, including parathyroid hormone. This is the main hormone that's trying to balance your calcium levels. First of all, calcium is very important. Of course, we know it's needed in your bones for bone density, but it's also, don't forget, it's also needed for muscle contractions and nervous system functions. And so you have to have the right amount, the correct range of calcium to balance all of these factors. And so parathyroid hormone helps to increase the blood calcium levels, and that's because it directly stimulates the osteoclasts. The osteoclasts are the bone cells that are trying to break down the bone matrix, reabsorb the bone matrix into the bloodstream. When that happens, calcium leaves the bones and goes into the bloodstream. And so parathyroid hormone also helps stimulate vitamin D production. And once you have vitamin D, that helps to reabsorb calcium from the intestines. And so both of these lead to an increase in blood calcium levels. Calcitonin, remember, works the opposite of parathyroid hormone because it helps to lower the blood calcium levels, and it does that by slowing down the osteoclast activity. And of course, you can have too high and too low levels of calcium ions, just like you have for the other ions we mentioned. Hypercalcemia means you have too much calcium building up in the bloodstream. When this happens, you have problems with, again, action potentials, and your nervous system has problems because it becomes less permeable. Neurons become less permeable to sodium, which means they can't depolarize as quickly as they need to. And so that generally means you have reduced reflex actions. It goes to your muscles as well, muscle weakness. And because the calcium sometimes precipitates out, that may lead to kidney stones as well. Some of the problems here, it could be hyperparathyroidism, because if you have too much calcium, it could mean that your parathyroid hormone is being released too much, overactive. It could mean that you have too much vitamin D and you're causing your body to retain too much calcium. It could be a kidney problem. And they've also linked hypercalcemia to certain cancers because some of the cancer cells actually produce extra calcium. Hypocalcemia is too little calcium, and the neurons here can become actually more excitable if you don't have enough calcium. And that again goes back to balancing the sodium ions, when you're looking at the action potentials and the depolarization graph. And some of the symptoms here of having too little calcium is that the muscle cells are becoming stimulated too quickly. And eventually, if they're too fast, that gives a scenario called tetany, where the muscle cells don't have time to relax before the next contraction begins. Some of the causes there is maybe too low parathyroid hormone, or maybe you don't have enough vitamin D. Vitamin D, then, if you have very little vitamin D, then that could mean that your calcium that you do have in the body is not being reabsorbed by the intestines. Phosphate, this is another ion. This is found in the bones, the teeth. It's also in your phospholipids, so don't forget about those. The phospholipid bilayer that you have in your cell membrane, so it includes phosphate ions as well. You also find phosphate ions in proteins. It's also found in your nucleic acids, so your DNA, your RNA, your genetic material, and then your energy source, your ATP, that's a nucleic acid, also includes phosphate. Phosphate also helps to balance out enzymes and enzyme activity. Enzymes are critical in your body systems because they're responsible for making sure the chemical reactions are taking place at the proper rate. And then you also find phosphates in buffers, which we'll talk about a little later. And phosphate is balanced basically by the same hormone as calcium because of the parathyroid hormone. If you remember from 168, that bone matrix is basically calcium phosphate crystals. And so parathyroid hormone, when it increases the osteoclast, not only is it releasing calcium into the bloodstream, but it's also releasing phosphate into the bloodstream as well. Now, the last ones we'll look at, chloride ions. This is the main anion that you're going to find. An anion is a negative ion, so this is the main anion that you find in the body. Of course, you need it for making hydrochloric acid. That's the acid in your stomach. It's also involved in the what's called the chloride shift. And so if you go back and look at how red blood cells, carry carbon dioxide by, turning it into that ion, bicarbonate ion, then you have to kind of balance out the negative ion there. Then you need another negative ion to balance that out. And so chloride fits in well there for what's called the chloride shift. And then you basically balance the chloride the same way you balance your sodium ions, and that's through the kidneys. And that's because the sodium and the chloride are connected together as salt. And the last main ion we'll look at for this chapter is blood magnesium levels. And so magnesium is an important ion because it helps enzymes become activated. So that's called a cofactor. Cofactor is some kind of molecule that activates or kind of turns on enzymes. For example, you have sodium potassium pumps in many different parts of the cells or different cells. And for these sodium potassium pumps to operate, they have to have certain enzymes there to operate. And those enzymes need magnesium or some type of cofactor to help establish that membrane. Usually it's some type of gradient that the sodium potassium pump is trying to establish. They also is part of the bone matrix as well, and the regulation of magnesium is basically controlled through the kidneys. Now, the last section is looking at acid-base balance. So far, we looked at fluid balance, number one. We also looked at electrolyte balance, number two. So we need to look at acid and base balance, number three here. And you're balancing your pH levels really through a couple of main systems. One, basically through buffers. So first of all, a buffer is anything that helps to resist a change in pH. If you remember, your pH of most of your body fluids, including the blood, should be somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45. So that is slightly basic. That's a little bit above neutral, but it's still basic or alkaline. And so you have to have ways to balance that. And so you'll have buffers. You have chemical buffers. We'll talk about that first. Three main types of chemical buffers. And the way buffers work is if the acidity levels rise, if you have higher than normal acid level, that means you have too much hydrogen ions. And so that means the buffers need to bind to and take out of the solution some of the extra hydrogen ions to try to help lower your acidity level. If your acidity level is falling, if the acid level is going down, that means you're becoming more basic, then your buffers need to be able to release hydrogen ions to try to bring your acidity levels back up. So there's three main types of chemical systems. Several of these we've seen already. So for example, the carbonic acid system, there's the equation. We've seen this back in the respiratory chapter. Carbon dioxide, when it combines with water, makes a carbonic acid. That dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. And so notice the equation is an equilibrium type equation. That means it can go either direction depending on what you need. So if you need more hydrogen ions to be released, then it can go forward in a forward direction. If you need less hydrogen ions, you can combine the hydrogen with a bicarbonate and it can actually go in the reverse direction. So it can remove, this is the power of a buffer, this weak acid system here can actually remove hydrogen ions, or it can donate hydrogen ions depending on, if you need more acid or less acid. So number one is the carbonic acid system. Number two is a phosphate buffer system. Anywhere you find that high on phosphate, you'll find basically an inherent buffering system. And this is mainly found intracellular, mainly found inside of the cells. So think about the places we just said you find phosphate in your ATP, your DNA, and your RNA. Those are three main areas that you find phosphate inside of the cell. And so it basically works the same type of way. You have an equilibrium type reaction that can either donate hydrogen ions into the solution to make it more acidic, or it can absorb some of the hydrogen ions and actually go in the opposite direction to try to make it less acidic or more basic. Then number 3 is a protein buffer system. Proteins act as natural buffers. And many times you find these inside of the cell or inside of your blood plasma. You have different proteins inside the plasma, and they help to naturally balance out the acid and base levels, the acidity levels inside of the body. That's because they naturally have an acid group. Each protein is made out of amino acids. Well, they have an acid group, that's a COOH, which is called the carboxylic acid group. And then they have a base group, an alkaline group, that's the amino group, and that works as a base. And so they naturally, just based on their structure, naturally work as a buffer. So anytime you find these types of proteins inside the cell or in the plasma, one of their jobs is to help buffer the pH. They estimate that provides 60 to 70% of all the buffering capacity in the body goes back to proteins. A couple of examples, you have many more examples, but a couple of examples here. The hemoglobin that you find in the red blood cell, not only does it bind to the carbon dioxide and oxygen, but also functions as a buffer inside of the blood. And then the histone type proteins that you find kind of wrapped around or entangled around the DNA molecule. All of your cells are going to have the DNA there. And so that helps in a buffering capacity as well. And then you have several proteins just in the plasma that help in buffering. Then another system that helps in balancing your pH is your respiratory system. And we've seen this before as well, based on the same equation. As CO2 levels increase, your pH decreases. So if you look at the equation, here's carbon dioxide. If the CO2 levels goes up for whatever reason, maybe you're not ventilating enough, CO2 levels go up, that means more hydrogen ions are going to get released into the system. That means pH starts going down. Your acidity level increases, pH goes down. As CO2 levels decrease in the equation, as CO2 levels go down, maybe you're hyperventilating, then that means more CO2 leaves the body, and that means less hydrogen ions are produced, and that means less acidity or pH goes up. And so there's those two words again. Hypoventilation increases blood carbon dioxide levels, and hyperventilation, you're breathing too fast, that lowers how much CO2 levels you have. Then the last main system that helps to regulate pH is your kidneys. And not only are your kidneys balancing fluid, it's balancing hydrogen ions. And so if pH, I've got two scenarios for you. First scenario is your pH is starting to become lower. It's maybe going closer to the 7.35 zone. And what that really means is you got too much hydrogen ions. Well, if you have too much hydrogen ions, you need to get rid of some of those hydrogen ions. And so your distal tubules can increase hydrogen ion secretion into the urine. You get rid of more of the hydrogen ions to try to fix the problem. At the same time, you can reabsorb some of this bicarbonate. This is like a sponge that helps to soak up some of the extra hydrogen ions from your blood. And then the other scenario is if the pH rises. The problem here is you have too few or too little hydrogen ions. You can just do the opposite. You need to slow down the hydrogen ion secretion to the urine. You need to hold on to more of it. And you can also decrease your bicarbonate absorption into the blood. Now, the last two things we need to look at are the terms acidosis and alkalosis. Acidosis is any time the pH of the body fluids fall below 7.35. Remember, it's supposed to be 7.35 to 7.45. So if you go below 7.35, that's considered to be acidosis. You can see some of the main symptoms here: nervous system, depression, drowsiness, unresponsiveness, coma, and it can be fatal. If you have acidosis that is attributed to something with the respiratory system, then it's referred to as respiratory acidosis. So maybe you're hyperventilating. You're not breathing out enough CO2. The CO2 starts to build up in the body. Maybe you have asthma or emphysema or COPD or whatever the case is. Maybe there's some problem with the respiratory center in the brain in the medulla section. Then that could cause respiratory acidosis. Anything other than the respiratory system that may contribute to acidosis is called metabolic acidosis. And so these certain things here can cause this extreme diarrhea, overdose of acidic substances, including certain medications like aspirin. Diabetes can eventually cause this. Um, Kidney problems and many other things can cause metabolic types of acidosis. Alkalosis, this is just the opposite. This is where your pH of the body fluids rise above the 7.45 area. And you can see some of the symptoms here: hyperexcitability of the nervous system, numbness, tingling, muscle spasms, seizures, and it can also be fatal. And again, it's kind of set up the same way. If it's can be attributed to the respiratory system, that's referred to as respiratory alkalosis. This is usually caused by hyperventilating. Maybe a panic attack or anxiety attack. You're breathing too quickly. That means you get rid of too much CO2 too fast. That causes your pH levels to rise. It potentially could be a high altitude disorder. You don't have enough oxygen, and that could also cause more higher increase of CO2 levels, and that causes, a lower amount of CO2 levels, and that causes alkalosis. Anything other than respiratory would be metabolic alkalosis, and that could be vomiting, could be severe vomiting, or it could be ingestion of some alkaline substances. Sometimes you don't hear about alkalosis as much as acidosis. Sometimes you do hear about individuals that maybe take too many antacid type medications that cause an imbalance in their body fluid pH and may actually cause their body fluid pH to go above the 7.45.